Hi, welcome back after lunch. I'm Nick Diakopoulos. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my research on algorithms, automation, and AI in news production. I guess on the one hand, you could say I've been working the past 10 years of my career toward this talk, but in reality it's more like I've spent the last 18 months looking specifically at the role of automation and algorithms in newsrooms. I'm a professor at the School of Communication at Northwestern University, also a professor in the Department of Computer Science, so I try to span those two worlds. So hopefully I can give you a new perspective on what I'm seeing in terms of AI in news production. Okay, so let's get this out of the way. AI is probably at a pinnacle of hype. Okay. Now it's at a pinnacle of hype. Fully automated news production is certainly tantalizing, without a doubt. And there are, I think, some genuinely very impressive things that AI can do and can be very helpful in journalism. Everything from enhancing investigative journalism with machine learning and data mining, creating new interactive media like newsbots, some of which we'll hear about later today, optimizing content on distribution platforms, and generally enhancing the scale and the speed and the efficiency, the breadth, the ability to personalize content. Some of this might even seem a little magical, but let me assure you that AI is in no way actually intelligent. Behind the curtain, I think we need to understand the people, the designers, the editors, the reporters, the data scientists, the engineers who are contributing to the appearance of intelligence. And that's really what I want to focus on today, the people and the human issues that surface when we use AI for news production and journalism. So, in particular, I want to talk about two main themes. The first is about human values, and the second is about this idea of hybridization between automation, algorithms, and people. So, in terms of human values, this perhaps is no longer all that surprising to say, but people and their values are indeed embedded throughout algorithms, automation, and AI. And in the context of news media, a lot of that comes down to how news values and editorial decisions are built into the code that's running these systems, or the data running these systems. And I would argue that news organizations really do need to become more cognizant of their ability to embed their own organizational and institutional values into technological developments. And potentially that means getting into things like design and engineering. So whose values do you want running your news organization? Do you want Google and Facebook's values running your news workflows, or do you want to be able to build your own values into the technology that is running your newsroom? The second theme I want to talk about is this idea of hybridization. And this is something that came up over and over again in my research looking at this topic. One of the issues that AI really has, and one of its shortcomings, is that it's limited by what we're able to quantify about the world, the limits of quantification. And that limit of quantification really becomes a real handicap for AI and its ability to flexibly adapt to different scenarios, something that happens a lot in the news, right? The world is always changing. So anything outside the bounds of quantification becomes inaccessible to the algorithm. That means that any context that's important to good decision making, which is so often important and often the case in ethical decisions, will be left out. Decisions that are somehow non-routine or out of bounds will be lacking nuance. So I think practically the future here is in coming up with clever ways to hybridize and weave human capabilities together with algorithmic capabilities to find the complementarities where the weaknesses of either man or machine are not so acutely felt. So certainly the history of journalism is littered with examples of how news production has adapted over, to technology like introduction of telephony, photography, certainly, reproduction technology like photocopiers, and computerization in general. And I think, really what I'm focusing on here is what's the role of AI technology in impacting those changes. So I'm going to offer a few examples to give you a sense of some of the real journalism projects that are coming out that are using algorithms and AI in effective ways. And I hope to illustrate those themes using some of these examples. So the first area I want to show you a few examples in, relates to this idea of data mining and machine learning for story discovery. So when I say data mining, I mean capabilities of computers to be able to classify, predict, cluster, summarize, associate, detect changes and deviations in data. And all these capabilities are sort of coming together in different ways to enable journalists to find new stories. So I just want to show a brief video here. So let me jump over to my video, and hopefully this will work. So just a quick preface to this. This is a story that was done at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution newspaper in the U.S. in 2016. Where they use some of these data mining techniques to help them sift through very large volumes of documents to find interesting stories.
This story came from work that Danny Robbins was doing on doctors in the state of Georgia, and so we decided that we would take on a nationwide look at how pervasive the issue of sexual assault by doctors was across the country. I got involved in the project fairly early on when we realized that we'd ultimately be trying to build a database of physicians who have been accused of sexually assaulting patients. We started filing open records requests, and we started sending it to every state in the country.
It was stunning to us that medical boards would not have a system of tracking serious sanctions against doctors.
Some states don't even have board orders with descriptions of what happened on those websites.
Jeff created a tool that allowed us to scrape these websites to the medical board.
And these are basically bots that go onto a website and systematically search them and download the contents of the website. And then I set up a machine learning algorithm.
This machine learning program was able to flag the probability that an order involved sexual misconduct by a doctor.
That's when our team started looking at every state in the nation.
And the patterns seemed to hold everywhere, that there was a certain tolerance for this behavior among physicians that we just really didn't realize was there.
There really has been very little research done on this topic. It's not something that the medical community has really perceived as a problem. They viewed it as like these brief hiccups, these brief, rare events that are in no way emblematic of what's going on in medicine.
Okay, and now if we can, get back to our presentation. So that gives you a flavor for how this type of technology can be used. So just to walk you through it, how did they get that story? Well, a reporter that they had there was reading dozens of documents and found about 70 doctors just in the state of Georgia that had been sanctioned for sexual misconduct, but they were still practicing. So that was kind of newsworthy. Certainly an important story, but the question then became how widespread is this issue, and can we look at this nationally? Can we actually scale this up to look at this nationally? So to develop this technique, they started reading through hundreds of documents. They manually tagged some of those documents as interesting and other of those documents as uninteresting with respect to the specific types of documents they thought would be newsworthy for their investigation. And then they trained a classifier, and it was a logistic regression classifier. So, we don't even really need to talk about it as machine learning. It's statistics they're using here to be able to then predict whether or not a future document will be interesting or not. So in the deployment, they had more than 100,000 documents representing more than 60,000 doctors. They ran those documents through this classifier, and of course, tens of thousands of them were uninteresting, but then about 6,000 of them were interesting cases. And once they had those 6,000, then they could apply people power and have trained journalists with a high degree of expertise read through each of those cases individually. So this is sort of getting at this whole hybrid idea, right? We have the machine learning capability to scale up and look at a very large number of documents, and it's able to compress it down to enough documents that a team of reporters working for 6 months can actually read through that many documents and also do the additional reporting, digging into those documents to understand whether or not those should be part of the overall story package. Another example here of data mining in machine learning in story finding comes from this tool called newsworthy.se. So this grew out of a Google-funded project called Marple in Sweden, where they're really kind of looking at data mining almost as a sixth sense. So it allows journalists to find stories in large data sets and then generates news leads that look something like this, where it's actually generating some text on the left-hand side based on statistics in a data set, and it's generating a graph, and it's generating a headline, and it's generating some charts, and it's giving you links to be able to download data if you want to play with the data further. And it's then monitoring this data over time, so whenever new, and now it's actually working with Eurostat statistics, you can check it out, you can basically subscribe to alerts or triggers on different data sets that are being released by Eurostat, and it's going to send you an email update when that data set comes out with sort of a news lead. Whether or not you decide to pick that up and turn it into a story is another question, but it's trying to sort of lower the barrier to help you find interesting things that are going on in the data. Another example in the domain of social media monitoring comes to us from Reuters, and I want to actually show you this video as well. So let me jump back here to my videos. Jump over here. So certainly social media data, one of the most large-scale, overwhelming sources of data journalists are now coping with, and Reuters actually built a tool to try to help their journalists deal with it.
There are 4 channels. A user can define their own channel. So here I predefined 4 channels. The first one, we call it crises. There is no terms. It's just based on in newest the past 24 hours. I set it up to be loose in the facts. So show me things that look like rumors. Show me things that are not necessarily accurate, etc. And underneath it, you see some of the events that we are capturing. The next one is trending, and you see the live updates because I'm hovering here on top of it. The updates stop so that I can see it. This cluster contains 7,968 tweets. If you click on it, it's about the shooting that happens in a French school. I think
that just happened this morning.
Yes, that just happened this morning. So this is live. You can see the concepts and the topics that we algorithmically extracted and other concepts, etc. This means that it's newsworthy. This means that we believe it's true. Yeah? We defined a couple of more clusters, crises, bomb blasts, etc. We defined one on Trump taxes. So if you click on the actual cluster, you see.
I actually built this channel this morning with Colin.
Yes, you did. So this is running.
So you get the idea there. Basically, they're using a lot of machine learning behind the scenes to sift through millions and millions of tweets in real time. They cluster the tweets and media into events, and then they evaluate those clusters based on newsworthiness and veracity using more machine learning models. So it's this fantastic sort of composition of all these different algorithms that are running across this data that are grouping and ranking and evaluating content to try to help journalists orient attention to which are the events that we should be covering. So let me now jump back to my presentation again. And so why are they doing this? Well, Reuters, at least part of the Reuters business, is premised on competing on speed. And what they found is that in an evaluation, they found that this system allowed them to speed up the speed of their alerts in 84% of the cases that they tested. And just to give you one specific example, the Brussels airport bombing was in their data set that they evaluated. The system would have detected it 2 minutes before local media and 10 minutes before BBC. So for Reuters, who's, again, competing on seconds and minutes here, a tool like this can let them be the first on the wire with this kind of story. They're also using some veracity detection technologies in there as well. Not quite as compelling a result there. They're claiming that they can detect 75% of rumors and debunk them earlier than other news media with 80% accuracy. I show this because I think it points out an interesting limitation of these techniques, which is that machine learning and data mining often comes with an uncertainty bound on it. And the ways in which journalists think about incorporating that uncertainty into how they create knowledge is, I think, a very interesting direction for future study in journalism, understanding how do we make sense of all this uncertainty while we're reporting. But really, I think, just to circle back on this other theme, this idea of values and algorithms, I think what's important here is to think about how newsworthiness is encoded into all these story finding tools. So we have, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution story, the Newsworthy tool, and this Reuters tool, and they're all embedding some value of newsworthiness in the algorithm. They've all defined that in some way. But, of course, newsworthiness depends on who you ask. It varies with the individual, organizational, social, cultural context. It may depend on the fit with a particular editorial focus of a news outlet, with audience expectations. I would argue that newsworthiness is not intrinsic to an event. It's very much value-laden and context-specific. Going back to, sort of journalism studies, we can define news values in terms of proximity, novelty, salient, social significance, and so on. These are sort of the dimensions along which journalists might consider newsworthiness. But which of these values should we build into a story-finding algorithm? It's not clear. I mean, it might, again, depend on the context, what type of news organization, what type of leads you want to surface. Let me give you one more example here just to drive this home. This is a tool called ClaimBuster. I believe it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, automated fact-checking system. Now, it's not exactly fact-checking. It's more like fact-spotting. It tries to rank statements, textual statements, along a dimension that they marked as check-worthiness, so you can have less check-worthy and more check-worthy. And it's meant to help fact-checkers orient their attention to statements that are being made in the media that might be both fact-checkable and be interesting to fact-check. Okay, so that's what the tool looks like. You can actually play with it online and paste in your own text and try it out. So as part of the academic work on this project, the authors actually did a study where they compared the types of claims that their tool was marking as check-worthy and the types of claims that CNN and PolitiFact were marking as check-worthy. Now, CNN and PolitiFact are manual processes. So they did a bit of a comparison. And what you're seeing in this chart here is actually that ClaimBuster identified more claims about the economy and fewer claims about social issues in comparison to CNN and PolitiFact. So if reporters were to rely solely on ClaimBuster to identify and guide their attention towards check-worthy factual claims, you could argue this would decrease the attention that fact-checkers give to social issues, and this may not be the outcome that is desirable from a public interest standpoint. Now, another evaluation of ClaimBuster looked at 21 transcripts of U.S. presidential debates in 2016, and showed that Donald Trump actually had fewer check-worthy factual claims marked than Clinton. So we know, because you can read essentially the description of the algorithm, that ClaimBuster heavily weights the presence of numbers and figures in its selection of sentences that it marks as check-worthy. And this kind of suggests that Trump's rhetoric and his mode of communication may have made his statements less susceptible to being marked as checkworthy by the system. So I would argue that as automated fact spotting techniques become adopted in practice, it's very important to assess how these tools impact the coverage of various types of stories, various types of claims, various types of events, and modes of political rhetoric. Journalists are really going to need to become more cognizant of the ways that algorithms orient or divert attention in characteristic ways and try to compensate and fill in as needed. Okay, I want to talk also a little bit about another area of automation within journalism related to automated text production. By now, this is a bit of an older example. This is the type of story that the Associated Press in the U.S. has been publishing since 2014. It's an automated earnings report. It takes the earnings report data about almost 4,000 companies now every quarter and generates these short stories based on that data. It's template based, so they've sort of pre-written some sentences, and the data gets piped in and it outputs a story. More recent example, the Washington Post is now using their own version of this technology and used it in the coverage of the 2016 elections in the U.S. So a little point of comparison, in 2012, the Washington Post covered 15% of the congressional races that were occurring in 2012. But in 2016, when they rolled out this technology, they covered 100% of the federal and state elections. And moreover, they were dynamic throughout election night. So as new data came in, they were able to update these stories. So that gives you an idea of the increased ability for breadth and comprehensiveness of coverage, but also, the ability to kind of keep these things updated over time. And then an even more recent example from Sweden. This site called Klackspark uses automation to write stories about football games across all of the divisions of local football. So they do all 6 divisions of local football in Sweden. But what's really interesting, I think, is that these data-driven stories are actually orchestrated with 14 human sports writers to produce the content for this site. So the automated writing software takes the structured data about each game and writes and publishes a short, roughly 100-word long factual summary of what happened in the game. It's not really too fancy. That might include things like who scored and some history of what happened in the league with respect to that team. So the automation provides some foundational sort of breadth of coverage, but then people, experts, sports reporters can come in behind the automation and add on top of it. They can be alerted if there's something unusual in a particular story, and then they can go out and interview someone, or go out and do additional reporting, get some quotes, flesh it out, and add to it. So again, automation provides breadth, but automation plus professional reporters adds depth to the coverage. So in terms of this theme of hybridization, I wanted to talk about how people and algorithms are sort of coming to work more and more closely together, right? So we're finding these interesting collaborations where people need to be around to update, to tweak, to edit, to validate, to maintain these automated systems. Someone needs to be there in order to monitor if errors are made, and there still are errors that pop up with these systems. Someone needs to be able to override these systems when they mess up. And so we're seeing some skills and tasks and jobs evolving. So writing is going to need to evolve, right? So I mentioned that the AP system, actually all of these systems are template-based. So writers are going to need to evolve how they think about writing, and they're going to need to think about writing templates. You need to approach a story with an understanding of what's available in the story. What could I say with this data? How could the data give rise to different angles and stories? And what's the logic behind these bits of data and the variations in the data. You're still going to need people around to adapt or reparameterize these templates based on differences in data and availability, and so on. You're also going to need people around for doing maintenance and supervision. Again, at the AP, they have people who spend several hours every month making sure that the structured data about each of the companies that the automation reports on is updated, right? Have we, if the company changed their location of their headquarters, for instance, that's something that a human reporter would have to go in and update in that database. So in terms of how roles are changing, I think we could sort of look at three possibilities, right? We could see de-skilling of human workers, we could see upskilling or reskilling. So de-skilling is the loss of skills in the workforce. Upskilling is an increase of skills to meet new demands from sophisticated tools. And reskilling is essentially retraining. So we're going to sort of see some shifting in the role of human actors as they adjust to these algorithmic writing possibilities. Again, reskilling of the existing journalistic workforce will involve learning tasks like how to write templates to feed the automation, and may involve learning how to do some light coding. But in terms of, everyone always wants to know, our job's going to go away. I'm actually I feel pretty confident in saying that I don't think a large number of jobs are going to go away. I actually think that more jobs might be created through automation than will go away through automation in the domain of journalism and news production. So far over the last few years, we've seen new positions at Reuters, at AP. They basically have automation editors who have to oversee. Again, they're maintaining, supervising, and training people to use these tools. We see companies like Bloomberg actually creating entire teams and hiring several people to work on these types of developments. So far I'm seeing new jobs being created for people who have the sort of the upskilled abilities to work with these technologies. So again, sort of one final example here to maybe drive this home. This is an example of a user interface for writing these dynamic templates. So it kind of gives you a hint of what hybridization might look like in practice. It's basically a more complex word processor. We're basically talking about, in this case, a user interface innovation. And that's wrapped kind of around this automated content production capability. So you could kind of think about it as an alien word processor. It allows the author to write fragments of text that are controlled by data-driven rules. And this allows us to embed the human expertise into the structure of the template and how that template works. But then allows the computer to do what it's really good at, which is scale up this structure and write a lot of stories based on that once it's been defined. Okay, so there's one more domain that I want to talk about before I sort of start looking a little bit more toward the future, and that's this area of algorithmic accountability reporting. So this sort of gets at the idea of how journalism is adapting and responding to the growing use of algorithms in society. It's probably no surprise now that algorithms are everywhere. They're being used throughout the public and private sector. Certainly in the U.S., we see them, everywhere from political messaging to dynamic pricing, criminal justice applications, ranking of teachers, welfare management, and certainly throughout the media as well in terms of personalization, trends, search rankings, and so on. So with all of the pervasiveness of algorithms here, the question then becomes, well, how do we investigate these algorithms? And probably one of the most important stories in this line of work came out in 2016 from ProPublica, the story called Machine Bias, where the investigative journalists there were looking at whether or not a criminal risk assessment score was in some way biased. So if you're not familiar, criminal risk assessment scores are sort of checklists that are applied to individuals when they're taken into the criminal justice system in the U.S. They can be used for pretrial detention, for probation, parole, in some cases even sentencing. And so you fill out this form and it outputs a score. Are you low risk or are you high risk for reoffending as a criminal? Now what the investigation found is that black defendants who were scored tended to be assigned a higher risk score than white defendants, and that they were far more likely to be incorrectly labeled as high risk when, in fact, after 2 years, they hadn't been rearrested. So this is what the data looks like. You can sort of see in the top panel, you see counts of black defendants across each of the risk scores, low to high risk scores, and in the bottom panel, you see counts of the white defendants. And you can see pretty clearly the disparity there. So you have a large skew for white defendants toward having lower risk scores. So this is the kind of thing we're talking about when we say algorithmic accountability reporting. It's how do we investigate and explain how these algorithmic decisions arise in public and private sectors, and how do we characterize the bias and the power and the influence of these algorithms on individuals and throughout society. So as I've started to look out at this emerging beat on algorithms, the algorithms beat as I call it, I've noticed that there's 4 angles that seem to be emerging, 4 sort of different approaches to, or frames, if you will, for reporting on algorithms. Discrimination or unfairness, that's certainly where the ProPublica piece, machine bias piece fits. But there's also examples of algorithms being reported on when they make errors or mistakes that are sort of unexpected, or when they're violating laws or social norms like data protection laws or privacy laws. And certainly when, in many cases, when these algorithms are designed, there's sort of some context for which they're designed. So they can be recommended for use in particular ways. And so if you then find people who are misusing algorithms in ways that they weren't intended to be used, that can also be a sort of a newsworthy frame on algorithms. And if you're interested in learning more about this, I actually have a chapter coming out in the Data Journalism Handbook next month on this. As the algorithms beat emerges, new methodological techniques are needed. So, you know, everything from reverse engineering to auditing techniques are necessary to gather data on how these systems are operating, try to understand you know, whether or not there's errors popping up that are unexpected, or whether or not there's some bias with respect to some background distribution of behavior that you expect. Other methods include things like crowdsourcing, so you know, being able to set up these types of data donation campaigns or use plugins is another technique that's been used, as well as doing even, in some cases, code audits, where you're getting the code, you're reading through it very carefully to understand has the code been implemented correctly according to whatever policy is prescribed. So effective algorithmic accountability reporting, I would argue, demands all the traditional, it demands learning all of these types of methods, but then it also demands all the traditional skills that journalists need in reporting and interviewing. You need domain knowledge of the beat, you need to know how to do public records requests, you need to know how to write data-driven results clearly and compellingly, and then you need to know how to do all these things. You need to know how to scrape, how to clean data, how to design audit studies. You need to, in some cases, to know advanced statistical techniques to build credible evidence about these systems. So technologists and method specialists will certainly have expertise relating to the feasibility and limits of these types of advanced methods, but non-technical journalists will have expertise in some of these other areas. So I would argue that the best algorithmic accountability work will be done in teams with people working together with different types of expertise. Method specialists can partner with different domain experts, for instance, to understand algorithmic power across a range or variety of social domains. And I think this is probably a good opportunity for collaboration with academia, either social scientists who may be domain experts in some area, some social field where an algorithm is now being used, or computer scientists or data scientists who have expertise in these sort of data-driven auditing methods and can help from that side. Okay, so where do we go from here? What is the future of algorithmic news media? Well, I want to talk about three future considerations, actually. I want to talk about the direction that technology is heading here. I want to talk about the human resource, right? So sort of how are people evolving with respect to the technology. And then I want to take an even further step back and talk about the algorithms in society. So in terms of technical developments, and I would argue that these are sort of things that I think journalists and news organizations should be considering as they evaluate how to responsibly adopt and adapt to algorithms and AI in the news media. The first thing I think they should consider is technological developments and keeping an eye on what's happening there. This is just an image of Google Home that I pulled. It's a little bit of a stand-in for this broader area of what I would call our voice technologies or voice capabilities that are emerging. And I think it's always important, as these new types of technologies are emerging in scientific research, or in this case, is actually to the point where it's being productized, I think it's really important for journalists and news organizations to be on top of this stuff, to be thinking, how could this be adopted or used in some kind of reporting workflow? So the specific technology actually that I want to show you here is something that Google introduced earlier this summer called Duplex. This is a voice technology that can collect structured information through natural voice interaction. So for instance, it could allow someone to book a restaurant reservation over the phone. So let me play this for you. This is an example of Google Duplex.
See, how may I help you?
Hi, I'd like to reserve a table for Wednesday the 7th.
For 7 people?
It's for 4 people.
4 people, when?
Next Wednesday at 6 p.m.
Oh, actually, we leave there for after 5 people. For 4 people, you can come.
How long is the wait usually to be seated?
When, tomorrow or weekday or?
For next Wednesday, the 7th.
Oh, no, it's not too busy. You can come for 4 people, okay?
Oh, I gotcha. Thanks.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
So that was a computer talking to a person making a reservation for another person. So that's sort of with the state of the technology of voice interaction right now. And certainly journalists who are interviewing other people are subjected to a far greater dynamic range of human voice interaction. But you can imagine for very specific sort of structured interactions where you just need a piece of data or information from a person, you might be able to actually use this type of automation to gather that data. So I've actually been exploring some of these ideas in a column that I'm writing for the Columbia Journalism Review. If you go back to June, I have a piece where I actually look at Google Duplex in some detail and try to sort of basically parse out what could the technology do for journalists in a kind of sobering way. So not trying to be flashy or ridiculous about the technology, but what's the real potential here for this type of automation to help with what I think is one of the most expensive tasks in journalism, information collection. So the tech needs to be understood, but it also needs to be thought of and adapted in context. And I'm not suggesting that this technology, by the way, would replace any reporters, but I think it would enable new types and new scales of data-driven reporting. So it would be great, I think, a very good idea for news organizations to be in touch with scientific communities developing these types of technologies, including communities like knowledge discovery and databases, KDD, several machine learning communities, as well as the human-computer interaction, that's SIG-Chi community, and the computation and journalism community. Sort of the second future-oriented thing I want to talk about is the development of the human resource. So how will people need to evolve responsibly in light of sort of the direction of automation and AI? So I think there's sort of 3 things to talk about there. The development of computational thinking, the development of data thinking, and the development of advanced methods training. So in terms of computational thinking, this is really the idea of getting someone to be able to think about and formulate problems and solutions to those problems that can be carried out by computer programmatically. I would argue that computational thinkers will be able to exploit the capabilities of automation and algorithms to find news leads, to tell stories in unique ways, to creatively apply algorithmic approaches to new tasks and challenges. And it's really going to allow people to be effective, I think, effective managers of automation and algorithms in newsrooms. Certainly for future designers of algorithmic media systems, computational thinking offers a way for approaching problems through abstraction, modeling, decomposition, and so on, which can really allow them to think about the creative potential of the technology. Data thinking, I think, is likewise going to be essential for journalists and other practitioners working with algorithmic media. So, if we think about algorithms are the verbs, they're the actions, and data are the nouns, they're the things. You really need to have both algorithms and data in order to be completely fluent in computational capabilities. So you need to know how to collect data, to sample it, to clean it, to query it, to validate it, to critique it. Every stage of data manipulation you sort of need to be aware of. And I think that's going to be a key ability in sort of developing the human ability to work with algorithmic media. And then finally, this idea of advanced methods training. So I think in order to sort of push algorithms and data as far as they can go in journalism, to have the best chance of that, you're really going to need to have some advanced methods training. If you want to be able to produce sound evidence based on a statistical model, you need the statistical background to do that. So you may need some advanced statistical method training. Everything from inferences to interpretation and coping with uncertainty, I think, are going to be incredibly important. So what does this mean in terms of education? How do we develop this human resource in terms of computational literacy, data literacy, and advanced methods training? What kinds of educational offerings are needed? In my opinion, I think there's still a lack of qualified instructors for these topics. Not just in the academy, but also if you think about sort of the traditional apprentice model in newsrooms where editors are training newer journalists. I don't think there's enough people in newsrooms who know all of these things who could sort of train journalists in these techniques. So again, it's sort of my contention, my belief that we may need separate graduate degrees in computational and data journalism that are able to teach this new breed of educator, practitioner, scholar. Now, for practitioners, we might imagine a doctorate of professional practice in computational journalism. That's sort of how clinical fields like psychology and physical therapy handle advanced professional degrees in the US. We might also imagine a PhD in computational journalism that would be focused on how to generalizably apply computational thinking to issues in journalism, not just in reporting, but throughout the algorithmic media production pipeline. And I think by training more academics with doctoral degrees in this field, we can help to build that next generation of teacher, scholars who can then bring these skills more widely. Okay, the last area that I want to talk to as sort of a forward-looking thing is this question of algorithms in society. So we've been hearing a lot about fake news recently. We're starting to see some of the implications of AI and the ability to synthesize media and how journalists are going to react and respond to that. So some of you may have seen videos like this. This is an example of synthesized media. Deep learning algorithm has looked at thousands of hours of video, and it's learned how to synthesize new video clips that can, in fact, be controlled by a source actor. So if you can see this guy up here, he's moving his mouth in funny ways. This is the input video down here, and this is the output video over here. And you can see Trump's mouth is reacting and responding in the same way as the input actor's mouth. And, this is now being used not just for video, but for images, for audio, for text. we're seeing vast new capabilities of technology to be able to generate media which doesn't reflect what actually happened in reality. Now, I think in this talk I've showed you several examples of, sort of the responsible use of automation and algorithms and AI in journalism, using, embedded with pro-social values that reflect the public interest. But certainly automation and algorithms and AI can be misused by bad actors, right? In the wrong hands, the same technologies that enhance production for journalists can be used to enhance disinformation for bad actors. So again, this system demonstrates this idea of video puppeting, but there's lots of other technology being developed there. What should be the response here from media? What happens when the public can no longer trust videos that they encounter online? We're going to need major investments in the domain of media forensics, both in developing core technologies as well as designing interfaces to hybridize those media forensics techniques for human operators, for journalists to use. Now, interestingly enough, there's hundreds of scientific publications being published every year on the topic of media forensics. A lot of this stuff sits on buried in databases, but could be translated into useful tools that help address this problem. So again, I think news organizations need to get on this. They need to start taking some of these capabilities into practice. So how will things change? I think we're going to see some new beats emerging as journalists sort of cope with how AI is impacting society in different ways, both in algorithmic accountability, so looking broadly at how algorithms are impacting society, but also in terms of looking specifically at things like how bots are automating media dissemination online. How is automation being used to manipulate the visibility of certain things? This is sort of a new beat for journalists to be able to report on. Kind of think of it as like, what's the social media weather report today? We need to get a lot of, in the same way we have a lot of weather data, we need a lot of social media data. We need sophisticated satellites on that data to understand it. And then journalists need to interpret that data for the public so they know sort of which way are the bot winds blowing today. And then finally, I think there's sort of an interesting new beat emerging related to the synthesized media forensics. So again, if we can't trust our eyes in terms of what we see online, who are we going to trust? Well, maybe we can trust well-trained journalists who are credible and are armed with advanced forensics tools. Someone's going to have to worry about the authentication of mediated reality. And I think there's a good argument to make that journalists are in a pretty good position to make that happen. So in closing, I just want to kind of summarize and reiterate what I've been talking about here today. So the pervasiveness of human values and news values in algorithmic media, the hybridization of work processes, and how new journalistic endeavors are adapting to cover AI in society. And certainly I want to remind everyone that it does ultimately, I think, come back to the people and how people are using these tools. What animates algorithms are the people who design and develop and operate and maintain these tools. And I very strongly believe that the future of algorithmic media needs to be human-centered. But I'm entirely confident that at least some of the people in this room are inventing and will continue to invent that future of algorithmic media. So that's it. Thank you very much. I would invite you to be in touch. I want to point you toward a couple of resources on my website. You can find research papers related to many of these themes. You can also check out algorithmtips.org. This is a site related to the algorithms beat. You can get examples, methods, references, and so on there. And I wouldn't be an academic if I didn't shill from my forthcoming book. So I hope you'll check out my book, which will be out early next year, which talks about automating the news. So thank you very much. Do we have time for questions?
5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay.
So,
any questions? Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was a great talk, Nick. It was really fascinating to listen. And I have a question. What would you think the development that we are currently seeing in datafied/algorithmic journalism would mean for citizen journalism? Or for really actors who are not that well directly related to the traditional or institutionalized journalistic organizations? Because, you know, back in like 10 years ago, when we had the development of social media, there was an idea that now we have social media, now we have citizen journalists, we don't really need traditional journalists anymore. Now we have kind of churn with traditional news organizations really integrating a lot of developments from social media, like algorithmic personalization, recommended designs. What would be in the next 10 years? Will we again see the rise of citizen journalists who would be using really sophisticated algorithmic solutions, which would be really slow to integrate into traditional newsroom? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thought. I guess it's, you know, the way I sort of frame things, it's sort of an expert's game in a way. Like, you need to be really highly computationally literate, really highly data literate, you need statistical training. I wonder to what extent sort of citizen journalism really maps into this space so well, just given the expertise gap. But I mean, I think there could be some possible overlaps. You know, in particular, this idea of media forensics. I think that if we can do a good job translating some of these algorithmic techniques for forensics into tools that then people can use, then we can start talking about training people how to use those tools effectively to help do sort of crowdsourced verification or crowd reinforced verification. But even in those scenarios, I think oftentimes the model that ends up working is when you have an expert who is coordinating a crowd. So you need leadership within crowds, and oftentimes that leadership comes from professionals who are trained and who are directing the crowd in useful ways. So I guess that's, yeah. Yeah, another question?
Famous. I just want to ask, what do you do with the data and with the documentation of the methods? Once you finish your investigation, then all your data is thrown away. You don't have the time, you don't have the storage, you don't have what? On the other hand, more and more journalists, data journalists, want to make sure that maybe next week I'm questioned quite a lot, I go to law and I'm enforced for whatsoever, so I better document. How do you see that situation? What is necessary to document sufficiently recommendation of data and methods and analysis and variations and so on?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and something I oftentimes talk about in parallel with this idea of algorithmic accountability is how much newsrooms are now also using algorithms in the production of evidence that they use to drive their investigations and so on. So in order to be sort of ethical stewards of algorithms or ethical users of algorithms, what are the right ways to provide transparency of method so that our readers can ultimately trust the evidence that we're producing? I mean, I think there may be some minor variations, but I think open science is a good place to start in terms of the expectations for methodological transparency and data transparency. I think you certainly want to think about how to disclose at least a sample of the data that you used. Again, there may be privacy issues in certain cases, but there may also be ways to redact and do privacy preservation in that disclosure. There should be techniques for disclosing, you know, at some level, in some cases it may be necessary to disclose the actual code that was used to analyze and produce evidence for a piece of journalism. But there's a growing set of examples, I think, of newsrooms that are actually doing a good job. Actually, BuzzFeed News is doing a really good job with this. If you've looked at their GitHub page, for many of those investigations, they're allowing you to go layers and layers into those analyses. They're providing samples of the data that they're using and so on. So I think, it's not going to be for every story that you're able to provide the resources to do that, but I think if you're making a claim in public that relies on statistical evidence, I think you better figure out how to disclose those methods and the procedures that you used. Otherwise, how are you backing up your claim?
So one last question, then we have to switch over to the next session. Please, a brief.
Did the big companies like CNN, did they actually use this technologies of automating the news, especially in this 24-hour campaign against Trump? Everything, our news factors is created by human beings or by algorithm or the technology behind it.
On CNN?
Yeah.
Oh, I haven't studied CNN, and actually that's interesting. I haven't, I don't know anyone at CNN who's using these techniques directly, but actually it wouldn't surprise me if there was people using this at CNN. I mean, it's just such a massive news organization that I almost can't imagine them not using some form of automation to keep track of things. But I don't know about specifics.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks a lot
All right,
for being here.